Why do you think Chicago is the way that it is, and why has the mentality not changed?
Windy City, Chi-Town, Chirac. Chicago goes by many a moniker, but to an outsider, a few things spring to mind when thinking of Chicago. The Bulls, the Bears, Kanye, and the city's propensity for murder, earning the nickname Chirac in the early 2010s by a stupendously high murder rate, literally worse than Iraq's. More specifically, Chirac being the city's south side and part of the west side. Over the decades, some of America's most beloved personalities made it out, while the good majority were stuck in some of America's worst hoods, many jail-bound or grave-bound. In the 2010s, daily updates on gangland activities via YouTube and Reddit started to pour in, the eyes and ears of the city for the rest of the world to marvel, and thank God they weren't born there. But what most people don't know is that even with the rep Chicago has today, it was a lot worse 50 years ago. In fact, the all-time record was in '74, followed closely by '92. Like a lot of issues in America, Chicago's homicide crisis isn't anything new, it's just being recorded. Chi-Town is one of the most diverse cities in America, and probably the most stark example of American segregation. You could even say it laid out the blueprint for how segregation would work in the rest of the nation. Starting with the 1800s, many races made their way to Chicago with the dream of prosperity, but found strife instead, and constant reminders they weren't welcome. A very tribal mentality took hold with different ethnicities banding together, so gangs were born from a need to both protect themselves and to keep other races out of their neighborhoods, evolving into complex armies with rules, hierarchy, dress codes, and alliances, setting off a ripple effect that spread through the country. Only Los Angeles has been more influential on America's gangland, and only New York has older gang culture. In this video, we'll be taking a look at 100 years of these gangs in Chicago, a mostly Italian and Sicilian mafia that took over from the Black Hand gangs in town. Black Hand gangs were basically extortionists who sent letters with the Black Hand on them, implying a threat of violence if one did not pay, or they extorted locals by creating a problem and then charging you to stop the same problem they created, like throwing a brick through a shop and making you pay so it didn't happen again. In the early 1900s, it was founded by one of the city's many poor Italians, James Big Jim Colosimo, and funded by his brothel empire, more than 200 across Chicago. It grew to become the largest mafia in the city and the whole Midwest. With the onset of the Prohibition, Big Jim was under a lot of pressure to get in the bootlegging business. He was stubborn and refused. He was also very sprung with his new wife, Dale Winter. Sensing a big opportunity, Johnny Torrio, his second in command, had him called over to his restaurant to pick up a shipment. When Big Jim pulled up there was no shipment, just Torrio's men and orders to kill. He was ambushed and shot to death. Johnny Torrio took over the Chicago outfit and soon hired a bodyguard amongst his crew, a burly Italian kid from Brooklyn, with 3 distinct scars on his cheek, America's favorite gangster, and the original Scarface, Alphonse Capone.
I came to Chicago with $40 in my pocket. My son is now 12. I'm still married and I love my wife dearly. We had to make a living. I was younger than I am now and thought I needed more. I didn't believe in prohibiting people from getting the things they wanted. I thought prohibition was an unjust law, and I still do.
Capone grew up around drunk sailors and prostitutes around New York's naval yards. Hailing from a respectable family, he had other prospects in life, but chose to be a gangster in his teens, joining the notorious 5 Points gang and receiving mentorship from Frankie Yale, a legendary New York mobster who Capone would have killed in a few years. Young and brash, he had worked as a bouncer in the local bar, when one day a girl walked in and he made a lewd comment about her shape. Unlucky for him, her brother walked in with her. He pulled a knife and slashed Capone in the face 3 times. It took 80 stitches to close them, and Capone carried the nickname Scarface till his death. After arriving in Chicago in 1920, he mentored under Torrio for 5 years before Torrio was shot and almost offed in 1925. Torrio retired after this, and now Capone stepped up and started the most legendary 7-year run in American gang history. Capone had his hands in every seedy enterprise in Chicago, ranging from bootlegging to pimping to election fraud, earning him enough to be a billionaire in today's currency and one of America's most richest men of all time. The main focus for the gang was bootlegging alcohol that mainly came from Canada. The prohibition sprang an insatiable demand for booze in America's low-income neighborhoods, meaning a gold mine for underworld criminals, only comparable to the surge of cocaine and crack in the 80s and 90s. Bootlegging was a violent business though. Capone's Southside gang battled the Northside Irish gang over the 7-year period of Capone's rule. Capone wiped out 3 of the Northside gang leaders in a few years. Al Capone quickly built solid political connections, even controlling the leader of his Cicero neighborhood, which he effectively ran as his gang's stomping grounds. He was connected to the city's mayor as well. He was even known to send gangsters with Tommy guns to voting booths to make sure people voted right. Aside from that, he was powerful enough to routinely have witnesses, cops, or politicians killed. Unlike most gangsters and mafiosos at the time, Capone invited fame and notoriety and loved to see his face in the newspaper. He quickly became a national celebrity too. When asked about his dealings, he was quoted saying, "I'm just a businessman, giving the people what they want." As a side hustle, he ran speakeasies, gambling dens, and brothels as well, even having a basement where he could torture and murder people. Being the most powerful gangster in the city, he had a near monopoly on all the crime, getting more violent with every passing year. He became something of a domestic terrorist too, bombing bars that didn't buy booze from him. The Capone name carried so much clout that when his brother died in a shootout with cops, he had a 150-car motorcade for his funeral. In his personal life, Capone indulged in every vice imaginable, ranging from womanizing that gave him syphilis at 18 to a cocaine addiction that left an actual hole in his nose. Capone was rich enough to buy the affection of the locals and had soup kitchens all over the city during the Great Depression, making him a local hero. He was known to buy out whole train cars for him and his crew, and dude even had a mansion in Miami. Back in Chicago, his main rival was Joe Aiello, a former friend turned rival. Aiello was said to have 50,000 on Al Capone's head. According to Mafia lore, Aiello even famously sent over 10 gunmen at Al Capone. All 10 died before they got to their target. After all his attempts failed, Aiello fled to the city, but Capone had him tracked down in Rochester, New York. Realizing Capone could find him anywhere in the country, Aiello effectively gave up and came back to Chicago to wait out his imminent death. He got lit up and killed after leaving a friend's apartment. An autopsy found 30 bullets in his body. With all the money involved, even Capone's men were constantly trying to backstab him. Capone once found this out and publicly beat 3 of them with a baseball bat at a party before having them shot and their bodies dumped. But his most egregious act as a criminal boss was organizing the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone planned a fake police raid by 4 of his men on a warehouse run by the Northside Gang. It was an attempt to kill Bugs Moran, their leader. Once inside, the fake police lined the 7 men against a wall and called for shooters with machine guns and shotguns. The photos made nationwide news the next day and badly hurt Capone's image. It was such a bold act that it caught the attention of the president at the time too. As a result, Capone became public enemy number 1, and the FBI and government would start trying to get him for anything they could. Despite going on the run and even having his fingerprints removed, Capone was captured. But even with all the blood on his hands, Capone was only convicted on the 5 counts of income tax evasions in October 1931 and was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison.
On October 24th, 1931, after a 10-day trial, Al Capone was sentenced to the stiffest penalty ever given to a tax evader, 11 years in federal prison.
The king of the gangsters is about to be taken for a ride by your Uncle Sammy. It's moving day for Scarface Al Capone. The camera boys are all ready, so look sharp. Here he comes. That's Al, wearing the big white hat. Seems to be in a hurry, but where he's going, he'll have time and nothing but. And none of the good citizens of Chicago is exactly weeping about it.
Shipped off to Alcatraz off the coast of San Francisco and secluded in a small cage, completely removed from his former wealth and influence. He spent 7 years in jail. When he was released, the syphilis had spread to his brain. By the age of 40, he had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. He died in his Miami mansion shortly after his release. Allegedly, some of his fortune is buried out in the country till this day. As for the Chicago outfit, they continued for decades, but never as brazenly and openly as Capone days. In his brief lifetime, Capone grew the Chicago outfit into a criminal powerhouse. influenced the sharp mobster style of dress with fedora hats and pinstripe suits. He became a sensation through movies and TV shows of his exploits, influencing future mafiosos in the process. But for Chicago, he most notably left Southside a stigma it hasn't been able to shake to this day, the gutter of the city.
Rowdy kids. Troubled kids headed for trouble. Still a couple of years from real crime. But with destruction and violence their only outlet, they're on their way to it. Unless their outlook can be changed.
Known as the Greasers due to their Elvis Presley-style greased hair and leather jackets. Born out of white poverty and teen rage, Greasers operated as neighborhood protection units and became more active in response to increasing Latino and black faces on the South Side.
Where we're gonna go, tell me. You have to stay. If you're gonna go there, they're gonna go there too. They might as well get used to them and live with them. What else can you say?
With the onset of white flight, middle-class whites fled the South Side, leaving behind poor whites, white hillbillies from the South, blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans. Many Greasers were openly racist too, and had swastikas and KKK logos on their jackets and sweaters. In the 50s and 60s, they were even allowed by Chicago PD to run free to keep minorities scared. In a new take on gang culture, they had gang colors, symbols, and hand gestures as well. They also blurred the line between clubs and gangs, and had clubhouses all over the city for members. Most members would join in their teens and leave in their 20s. Before minorities came in the picture, tension did exist between some of these Greasers, and conflicts were mostly in the form of brawls, after-school dances, or basketball games, but guns were rarely drawn amongst Greasers. Noticeable Greaser gangs were the C-Notes. Their official color was green. Taylor Street was another big crew. They rocked light blue and white. Shy West were Ukrainian Greasers, formed to keep Latinos out of their neighborhoods. They had a skunk symbol, and members were even a part of the Ukrainian Mafia. Insane Deuces were another major gang. The standout gang of all the Greasers was the Almighty Gaylords, formed in 1953 in Westtown. It's actually the oldest street gang in Chicago and still exists today. In the 80s, it was Chicago's largest white street gang and the third largest overall, with 6,000 members. Their main rivals were the Latin Kings, Simon City Royals, C-Notes, Lazy Gents, and Playboys. Decades ago, they were known to roam in groups as big as 100 plus to crush the opposition. Gaylords were violent and were known for dragging dead bodies of rivals from the bumpers of their cars down the street. The Gaylords were also known for hanging dead members of Latin Kings from trees in Humboldt Park to send messages to their rivals. But in 1971, in a moment of unity, they formed the White Power Organization because Latino gangs were growing fast. This alliance ended in 1975 when the main mediator, Bimbo, from the Simon City Royals, was killed by the Latin Kings. With Bimbo dead, relations fell apart, sparking up old beefs again. A beloved Gaylord leader, Honky, was led out by the train tracks and executed by the Simon City Royals that same year. The Gaylords also gunned down the leader of the Insane Popes, Larry Larkin Morris, in April 1975, starting a war with the Popes as well. After these shootings, stabbings and murders between the Greaser gangs became more common. The Gaylords and all the other Greaser gangs went into a decline in the 1990s. But by this time, the Latin Kings, Black Gangster Disciples, and Vice Lords were the largest gangs in the city. They were making a killing dealing drugs too. The loss of territory and the appeal of money made many Greasers switch to Black and Latino gangs, and Greasers slowly died off and faded from the gangland after that. Not frequently acknowledged in the Chicago gang lore, but they were really a big catalyst in the formation of many Black and Latino gangs. It was all downhill from there. Chicago has a massive Latino population stemming from Puerto Rican and Mexican migration in the 50s and 60s. Several gangs emerged in Latino hoods, but standing out from all of them is the largest one, Latin Kings. Latin Kings were founded in 1954 by Puerto Ricans in Humboldt Park, but were originally the Imperials, though they only started to get attention after being mentioned in a newspaper in 1965. The original purpose of the gang was to fight back against violence from the Greek and Italian Greaser gangs, Police violence was another big concern and caused a division in street riots in 1966. And after a young Puerto Rican was shot by Chicago cops, after this, Puerto Rican and Mexican gangs emerged to form the street force as it evolved and set itself up in multiple states. Only Serenos and the Norteños outnumbered the Latin Kings in the USA. They have a strict code of conduct for each member, and the rule of fear keeps members in line because they have a detailed punishment system for members out of line. As such, Latin Kings are almost impossible to get info from. They have been and still are mainly drug pushers, while other side hustles include immigration fraud, robbery, and taxing drug dealers. Uniquely, they also let females in, and Latin queens are members of the gang. They rock black and gold colors, and every member is required to have Latin King ink as well. The Kings operate like a religion, even having their own prayers, and have 360 meetings where they chant Amor del Rey. That means love of the king. A strong gang graffiti culture is normal in Latin King hoods, and usually graffiti that isn't defiled by another gang means there's a strong set out there. Back in the 60s, their main rivals were Almighty Ambrose and Satan Disciples, both Mexican gangs. They had a long-standing beef with the Gaylords as well, and their main allies were the Blackstone Rangers. Though things have changed since then, today there's differing opinions on how different Latin King sets get along with the black gangs.
No, you don't go in no Mexican neighborhood, they gonna kill you. First thing they gonna do, like niggas talking about Cook County, niggas scared to come out Cook County. Niggas are gonna be a bunch of Mexicans coming out there, motherfucker. GDK, that's what they doing. They gonna try to trick you and blow you down. Oh my mama, niggas know. Everybody, ask any nigga in Chicago, nigga. Man, you better be on point. Your ride better be out there when you get bonded out, nigga.
Yeah, so in Chicago, Mexican gangs and black gangs, there's no real beef. If you bump into one, it probably won't go left.
Nah, you gotta be real out of bounds. And it'll only happen like little villages or something. But nah, I would say not really. It's really more, it ain't really like a race thing, it's more about what you is. Cause so let's say the same Mexicans who press you, right? They ain't pressing you because you black, but they will judge you and think that you is the other side of what they is. But if you one of them, we ain't even got to be the same gang, just like, on the same side as them, they'll leave you alone. It's just the ones on the other side. So it ain't really race, because if you could be black and you can be on their side too.
A 14-year-old Ramon Santos, a.k.a. King Papo, was the founder of the Latin Kings. On May 15, 1964, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans met in Humboldt Park and founded the gang to address beatings of Latino kids. King Papo had strong ethics and even wanted Latin Kings to have actual degrees before they joined the gang. Teenagers like Scarface, Gino, Don Juan, Black Saul, White Saul, Crazy Man, and Little Man were all OGs in the gang, but Gino became the most pivotal one. 51 years ago on June 27, 1971, a 16-year-old Gustavo Colon, a.k.a. Gino, got word that Glenn Burr, a vice lord, was on the corner of Potomac and Levis Street. Gino and a friend pulled up to the spot, and he spotted Glenn leaving his house. His friend remarking. No words were exchanged, and Gino approaches. Glenn, while firing shots at him, he falls down trying to run away. Gino stands over him and executes him. Gino then approached a girl in Glenn's group and put the gun to her head. He smiles at her before pulling the trigger and hearing a click. Empty. He spent all his rounds in excitement of killing Glenn. Gino and his friends scurry off into the dark. 2 months later, Gino was picked up by Chicago PD. His friend had already been murdered in an unrelated beef. There was no trouble finding Gino because there was plenty of witnesses to the murder. A year later, he got 30 years. Gino has spent every waking minute of his life in jail since. Given his OG status in the gang, before he went in, Gino still held rank in the Latin Kings and took it upon himself to write up a manifesto for the whole gang, a guidebook for rules and guidelines for every king had to follow, punishments for insubordination as well. After Gino drafted the new rules, King Papo was replaced by Gino, age 17. Lord Gino was South Corona and another OG. Baby King was North Corona. For years, he was running the gang with his wife via prison phone calls. Even though all the calls were recorded, something he would come to regret. He relayed orders back to Julius C. Lathrop Holmes, the HQ on the street, orchestrating all Latin King activities ranging from appointing leaders, expansion into the suburbs, murders, and major drug deals. He ran the gang inside too and orchestrated prison riots, guard killings, and drew up hit lists too. Meanwhile, Baby King was running things on the street, but he eventually caught a murder case. The gang also started to struggle with heroin addiction, and members were forced to either kick drugs or be beaten or worse. King Papo, the founder himself, even became a heroin addict and an unreliable leader. He disappeared and has never been seen again, supposedly killed on orders from Gino. The Kings joined the Folks Alliance in '74, but in '91 the Kings disregarded all active alliances and adopted an anybody killer policy. This drove up the murder rate, contributing to the peak in '92. Just one day before his release date in 1997, Gino was charged with running a multi-million-dollar narcotics operation from an apartment in Logan Square. He was given life for this and moved to ADX Florence, America's only supermax jail. A very sad day for the Kings because the streets were excited for his return and even ordered a limousine to pick him up. Lady Q, his wife, had walked away from the gang entirely, but only with Gino's blessing. Since then, Gino lost some power with the newer Latin Kings, not respecting his authority as much. King Popo's rule on having a high school diploma has long been forgotten too, with kids jumping off the porch at remarkably young ages.
Violence in the ghetto is like an infection. It spreads as the gangs grow in number and influence. But law enforcement authorities are determined to end that growth. A special grand jury will be convened in July. The police effort against the gangs is finally taking on the proportions of the war against the Capone mob in the 20s and 30s.
After the Great Migration, plenty of blacks moved to Chicago to work in the factories, often finding odd jobs or working jazz clubs. Not long after the war, the jobs were gone, leaving millions of black men unemployed. The projects they lived in became cesspits of crime and degeneracy. Many of them have actual snipers in the buildings, criminal dystopias that made it near impossible to make something positive out of one's life. Then the men got shipped off to jail, single mom epidemic, welfare, inner city 101. The black gangs that formed here had beefs with white and Latino hoods, but have always had a reputation for killing their own. Ironically, many of them started out as community youth groups, but got corrupted by the allure of criminal profits. To start with, some of the smaller cliques included the New Breeds, the Black Souls, the Four Corner Hustlers. As for the more reputable sets, you had the Mickey Cobras, founded by Mickey Cogwell. As the Egyptian Cobras, they became Cobra Stones and then Mickey Cobras after Mickey's murder in '61. The Mickey Cobras still exist, but there are only about 1,000 members left. The Vice Lords started in '78 at the Illinois Youth Center and initially named the Conservative Vice Lords with Edward Propello Perry as their leader. Being more of a youth club than a gang, they had government ranks and did community service as well, even getting donations from the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations. They slowly started to dabble in crime and controlled the Lawndale neighborhood. In '69, Bobby Gore was sentenced for murder and Willie Lloyd took over. Willie wrote a 61-page manifesto for Vice Lords during a jail stint, but Willie was constantly in jail, and Tyrone Baby Ty Williams took over and got rich off drug profits. When Willie Lloyd got out, Vice Lord politics had changed almost completely. Despite getting out of the gang life and even giving college lectures, he was shot and paralyzed from the neck down in '03. Named after Blackstone Avenue and founded by Jeff Fort in the Woodlawn neighborhood in '59. Eugene Bull Harrison was one of the other leaders. Fort also appointed the Main 21, and they became the leaders in the gang. They originally started out as the Blackstone Rangers, then changed to El Ruckin, and now Black P. Stones. They made their income from taxing pimps, local stores, and drug dealers. Unlike the other black gangs, the Stones were very outspoken in the media and drew a lot of attention to themselves in a time where FBI was waging war on black unity. Jeff Fort got 4 years in '72. In '76, Jeff Fort was released and moved to Milwaukee, where he now formed El Ruckin. Former Stones became Muslims and wore Muslim attire, with Jeff Fort being referred to as Chief Malik. El Ruckin grew in power quickly and even had ties to Gaddafi in Libya. Fort went down for conspiracy to exchange drugs and money for weapons with Libya. In October '87, Fort was sentenced to 80 years on domestic terrorism charges. In '88, a 75-year sentence was added for a murder. Jeff Fort now calls ADX Florence home and has been on a no-contact status since 2006. An alliance of two Inglewood gangs that would eventually split up, decimate the South Side, and spread across the country. But initially, the BGDs were a merger between the Devil's Disciples, led by David Barksdale, and Supreme Gangsters led by Larry Hoover. The Black Disciples were the first black gang in Chicago, but were initially called the Devil's Disciples. Formed by Davis Barksdale, a troubled youth with over 25 arrests in his lifetime. Boys aged 11 to 13 flipped through the Bible looking for a name for their crew and settled on Disciples, adding devil to it because it sounded fierce. At the time, the arch enemies of the Disciples were the Rebels from Inglewood, a gang 2,000 deep. The Devil's Disciples began to recruit in the 50s and 60s. and David Barksdale took over all the Devil Disciples in Inglewood. By 1965, they had the largest gang on the South Side. In '69, Barksdale made an alliance with another influential Chicago teen, Larry. Together they formed the BGD Nation, and this alliance would last for decades. The BGDs quickly grew to control the crime in Inglewood, Cabrini Green, and the Henry Horner Projects. The gang was structured like a corporation with ranks such as kings, bishop, and minister. Later in '69, the Vice Lords, Black P. Stones, and BGDs formed Lord Stones and Disciples, an alliance meant to fend off the Latin Kings and Greasers. This wouldn't last long, and the black gangs would start fighting again soon after. In June 1970, both David and Larry were sitting in a bar they both frequented when Stones rushed in with M14 rifles. David was hit with a 7.62 round, effectively destroying his kidneys, but he survived after Larry rushed him to a hospital. Eugene Bull Harrison was the orchestrator of the hit and would later be killed in '88. David died in '74 from complications from the shooting. '73 had been Larry Hoover's last year on the streets when a local drug dealer named Pookie was executed in an Inglewood alleyway. The cops picked up the shooter and Larry for ordering this. He got 152 years as a result and moved to Statesville Prison, where he would run the BGDs for decades. In response to the People's Nation Alliance, a few months earlier, King Larry formed the Folks Nation Alliance in a meeting at Statesville Prison. This was an alliance of white, Latino, and black gangs across the whole city. They each took up an almighty in their gang names. Meanwhile, on the streets, Dirk Ackland ran the gang until a murder charge in '78, at which point King Shorty was appointed to lead the BGDs. Mickey Bull was head of the Black Gangster Disciples in Robert Taylor Holmes. Rising the ranks, he went from the bishop to a minister in the BGDs, second only to Larry Hoover. He ran all BGD activities in the South Side and was immensely powerful in the '80s. All he had to do was whistle to summon a gun-toting BGD to his aid. Despite the frequent prison stints, he grew the BGDs into a multi-million-dollar organization. Cabrini Green was a $100 million a year operation alone. Mickey was respected and feared, but also the top op in the whole city. His summer '91 murder would mark probably the most pivotal moment in BD and GD relations. As time went by, money became a big factor in the '80s, and the BGDs got heavy into pushing weight. King Shorty got 28 years of drug charges as a result. As the alliance grew weaker, bodies started to drop on both sides, and the black gangs were even known to control different buildings in the same projects. '91 and '92 were particularly bad. On August 7, '91, some BDs shot at GDs in a taxi cab, hurting 2 and killing 1. Retaliation for the murder of Mickey Bull. Ever since this day, GDs and BDs have been the largest purveyors of homicide in the city. Because of these murders, '91 to '94 was all-out war. The violence prompted a big response from the feds, and in '93 they put listening devices on all visitors' ID badges for people that were coming to see Larry Hoover. They gathered months of information this way. Operation Headache took down Hoover and other high-ranking BGDs, and even Big Dirk, father to Lil Durk, he went down as well. As a result, Larry was moved to ADX Florence, where he joined Gino and Jeff Fort. Although while distracted by the '90s bulls, most of America and even Chicago was oblivious to the hell the South Side had become. The '94 murder of Robert Yummy Sandifer brought attention to the savagery of Chicago's black gangs.
Lost their children and babies to senseless gang and youth violence. Do you have a message of consolation for those mothers?
Yeah, I do. Like with Yummy, when he passed on, I know that hurt his family. I know it hurt the family of the female he supposedly had, shot.
It was an unusually chilly September night in 1994 as the body of an 11-year-old was loaded into the back of an ambulance. He had been shot twice in the back of the head in a hit ordered by the leaders of the Black Disciples. Craig was only 16 years old when his mugshot was plastered on TV, arrested for the murder of 11-year-old Robert Yummy Sandifer. His brother Derek, 14 at the time, was too young for his mugshot to be released. He was convicted of driving the getaway car. All three, Craig, Derek, and Yummy, members of the same gang, chasing money, respect, and trying to make a name for themselves.
Yummy, a 12-year-old orphan, a runaway, was handed a gun in order to kill some rival gang members. The next day, Yummy shot into a crowd of people, injuring 2 of his targets, striking and killing a 14-year-old girl, allegedly the daughter of a high-ranking GD. A few days later, Yummy's body was found slumped by the railroad track, with 2 bullets in the back of his head. 2 teenage boys got life for this murder, and the ages of everyone involved shocked the country. Chicago's projects had descended into the most dangerous zip codes in the country.
Now, okay, so I went to a school called Coleman Elementary Public School. All right, it was on 47th State Street. I live in the building preceding the school on 4500 South State Street. For short, we called the building 4500, right? Yeah. Then after that was 4555, right? I'm from Chicago, so you say 4555, like that, right? You know, 4562, you know what I mean? Like that, right? And then all those cluster of buildings were occupied by black disciples, like BDs, right? Like folks, right? And then after that was another cluster of buildings by GDs, right? GD folks, right? And they were rivalry gangs.
You're throwing up every sign as you say the games.
Yeah.
You're not a neutron.
Yeah.
This is not a neutron. You're spelling gangster with his fingers right here.
Yeah, like a pitchfork.
Can you do that?
Right? So listen. In my school, of course, you had kids who were from either given environment, right? They were from like the BD territory or the GD territory. There's one kid, I'll never forget this, and at the time, I had like a yellow Steelers coat. Like a starter coat. Remember that shit, the starter coat? Had a yellow Steelers starter coat, right? And this kid, he lived in the GD territory. Now, what that means is this. He would have to bypass the BD territory
just to get where
to get home in the GD territory.
I'm pretty sure that's a video game you're not gonna win, but ever so often. You might make it past that level once or twice.
Right.
You're only gonna make it.
Back.
Yeah, you need a cheat code for that one.
And you know it goes.
Genie.
Right, it comes in. That's it.
So he goes through.
I told him, you know what I'm talking about? I told him, I said, yo, take the train tracks, run down the tracks, come down, you go. Because you can bypass all that, right? Good looking. He did that. I'm walking home. They heard from him since. I look up, I saw my man running in the opposite direction. Then I saw a group of cats coming after. I said, oh, damn, he's gonna get caught. Then before
Press pause, man. Pause. Reset this game.
That's it.
It's my last continue, man. I can't be fucking.
Yeah, he's gonna be captured, right? They're going to catch this guy, and they're going to like demolish him or whatever. Now, right after seeing that incident, that whole scene, I found myself surrounded by about 10 BDs, right? And I'm like, oh, what's going on here? And one cat walked up to me, yo, man, we saw you trying to help homeboy out and shit. I said, I ain't nobody. He said, man, you the only motherfucker with the yellow Steelers coat. We know it's you. That's all right, man. And my mom is on the porch, 6'4". I lived in apartment 604. She's looking at me, helpless, defenseless. She can't do anything.
911, maybe?
You don't call the cops.
That's it. I understand.
No.
I get it.
I agree with you.
I get it.
But when you living in that context,
same way.
it's that shit, right? So I'm like freaking out. I'm thinking like, this is it. I'm about to get popped, right? The guy pulls out a gun. He's pointing it in my chest at this point. I'm about to die. And I'm accepting it willingly. There's nothing I can fucking do about it, right?
Did your light flash before your eyes?
Yeah, everything flashed before my eyes, and I think I may have felt some shit come out of my ass because I was just that fucking afraid, right? And then
what's your mom doing at the time?
She's just looking. She on the porch, you know
she's making his funeral arrangements.
So you know the projects, the facade of the Robert Channel was like this gate. So I could see her fingers through the holes in the gate, you know, the crisscross pattern of the gate. And right at that moment, some cat came out of nowhere. Yo, don't mess with him, man. He's cool, man. His mom be making us dinners and everything for Thanksgiving. He's good. The guy lowers his gun. The guy who saved me gave me a hug, whispering in my ear, yo, get out of here, man. They changed their mind quick. And he let me go, and I fucking ran home. I will never forget that shit.
Did you ever see those guys again?
Nah, never saw him again. Never saw him again. That shit was crazy.
Damn.
See, I had a lot of experiences like that one.
By 94, King Shorty relinquished the position as BD King, and Marvel Thompson became BD King, even helping in reducing violence. Thompson ushered in a new style of crime where computers were used to communicate and do drug deals. He ran the BDs from the Castle Randolph Tower, a $300,000 a day empire. Marvel even had his own radio station, 104.7, and sent out messages via radio. Residents and anyone else was searched at the front door by armed BD guards with automatic weapons and shotguns. Black Disciple snipers were posted on the roof of the buildings equipped with army-grade sniper rifles and night vision goggles so they could spot enemies and drop them. Given its murderous reputation, Chicago PD stayed far away from the castle, but all the while the feds had been running Operation Marvelous since '98. It took them 6 years to get Marvel and 40 other BDs. This ended the prime of the BDs, but did little to curb the violence of the war with the GDs.
If you had a gang fight here in the corner, everyone would bail out and we'd have a big fight. We'd beat the shit out of one another, kick and punch and shit, and then everyone would take off. Now a gang fight is you pull up in the corner with an Uzi, you spray the fucking corner and you take off.
As Chicago gangs evolved, the structures fell apart more and more, and leaders have struggled to maintain control. The crack era changed a lot because it allowed members to make huge sums of cash and run their own cliques. In the 2010s, drill music also became a big earner and a conduit for gang politics, also having the effect of drumming up global interest on small portions of the South Side that many drill rappers hail from. A lot of violence these days is predicated by a constant cycle of vengeance, spurred on by kids raised in the chaos of the BGD split. Not to mention social media and gangbanging go hand in hand nowadays, drumming up a lot of clout and also making jobs much easier for Chicago PD. The drill era Chirac has been marked by teenage revenge wars, remorselessness, and a public display for the world to see. For a look at one of the most prominent cases of these revenge wars, we have to go back to November 2015.
During the trial, it was revealed that Doty's DNA was found on a basketball that was located feet from 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee's body, and also inside an SUV that was used as a getaway car. There were also powerful recordings from a jailhouse informant that were played for the jury. Doty could be heard bragging about killing the 9-year-old and even laughing. Tyshawn Lee was lured into an alley with a promise of a juice box and shot in 2015. Dwight Brune Doty and fellow gang member Corey Morgan were accused of planning the 2015 murder. Prosecutors suspect that Lee was targeted, a casualty in an ongoing gang feud involving the boy's father.
Still dressed in his school uniform, the 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee left his grandmother's house for the park with the basketball in hand. 2 weeks before, gangster disciples from Killer Ward had killed Tracy, a black peace stone from the BBG set, and wounded his mother in a drive-by, highly likely provoked by a gang beef. The alleged shooters, GDs from Killer Ward. Pierre Stokes was a GD from Killer Ward. Pierre Stokes was Tyshawn's father. The Black Peace Stones couldn't find Pierre, so this would be Tyshawn's last day alive. Tyshawn was heading to the basketball park where 2 of his would-be killers, Dwight Doty and Corey Morgan, were waiting for him, fully intent on gaining his trust, luring him and executing him. For Morgan, this was more personal because Tracy, who had been killed a month ago, was his brother. It drove him mad enough to ignore a gangland code held by many criminals worldwide. No civilians, no women, and most of all, no kids. In Dawes Park, Doty approached Tyshawn and talked to him, and even played basketball to befriend him. He picked up the basketball and lured the boy to a nearby alley with Morgan and Edwards, watching him from a black SUV. As they walked down the alley, Dwight Doty took out a .40 caliber handgun, and they got caught not too long after, and caught up in a case that shocked the city, not just for the brutality, but for the lack of remorse shown. On a taped jailhouse conversation, Doty was heard saying, "In the end, Doty got 90 years, Morgan 65, and Edwards 25. All in all, it's easy to say that Chicago has always been a crime hub, and frequent murders are nothing new here. Century-old gang cultures, race-based gangs, and now drill music, a war zone for residents for the South Side and parts of the West Side, but out of sight and out of mind for the suburban residents.